Okay, we're going to pick up with video 2 here and talk about hydrocarbons slash particulate matter slash soot. So they all kind of are a form of the same thing. It's unburnt fuel. So you see people talk about how they like to roll coal and all that. Well, we don't really do that anymore unless you've made modifications. Basically starting in 2007, the term was, if you see smoke, then something's broke. We should see no smoke coming out of the exhaust on a diesel engine. So, the smoke we were seeing before was unburnt fuel. Black smoke is fuel that's not burnt all the way. Same thing in gasoline. If you see black smoke coming out the exhaust, then that's unburnt fuel. Diesel, same thing, only it's more prone to happen on a diesel engine before 2007. So, actually started showing up in 2004, but it was pretty much across the board. It just depended on how the engine was. Some of your smaller engines didn't have to have the DPF we're fixing to talk about, but across the board in 2007. So 2004 is when this first started showing up in the truck world. It didn't show up in the automotive and all that until 2007. So that's the split. It depended on what the base horsepower per hour gram limit was. So the smaller engines were able to get away with it automotive wise and whatnot. Some of the stationary stuff on-road trucks, it started in 04 basically, so it came out in 03 to meet the 04 emissions. So anyway, let's talk about how the diesel particulate filter works. Okay, so started showing up in the big truck world in 03 because in 04 we had to get our particulate matter down to 0.1 gram per brake horsepower hour. So the engineers had to come up with a way to accomplish that. So it took them a little bit to get the terminology down, or the technology down, not terminology, but the diesel particulate filter came into play. So the best way I can describe a diesel particulate filter, which is generally the first canister that we come to after leaving the turbo here. You can see we leave the turbo and come down, and we've got this canister here. So in this canister, I know I'm telling my age here, but think about this as like a burn barrel that people used to have to use out in the country. A few people still use it. So you had a 55-gallon barrel, the trash you generated from your household, everything that would burn got put in the burn barrel. So the burn barrel over time would start filling up, right? Because you take your trash out, throw it in the barrel, and eventually the barrel's full. Well, what'd you do then? You built a fire and you burnt everything down. So that's basically how this works, only it's taking unburnt fuel, particulate matter, soot, hydrocarbons, and it's capturing them inside here. There's a filter inside here that traps all that, so the exhaust has to go through, come back and through, so all the particulate matter gets trapped inside there. Okay. So we have some sensors here. We have some temperature sensors here, which we'll talk about later. So we got 3 temperature sensors. And we have 2 pressure sensors. Now the pressure sensors are up here under this shield. These are little hoses coming out. So what these do is they're called a delta P. So pressure, we're checking to see what our pressure is here and what our pressure is here after the particulate filter. So we're measuring the pressure in and the pressure at the outlet of the particulate filter. The computer monitors that. When we get enough trash, basically, we've got enough pressure, back pressure basically in the exhaust that it says, okay, it's time to burn. It will start heating up the exhaust. So a VGT works very good with this. We can start creating some restriction, building heat, allowing that heat to come out. So we start building up heat in the exhaust to have this. I'll get into all the steps of regeneration and temperatures in the next video, but for right now I just want you to understand we start building heat in the exhaust, because the exhaust heat in a diesel engine is not generally hot enough. You would think diesel would be hotter than gasoline, but gasoline actually runs a hotter exhaust system than diesel. That's because of our excess air we've talked about earlier that diesel engines run on. The excess air coming through the exhaust actually cools it down lower than gasoline temperatures, so that's kind of a little bit problematic. So we have to build heat in the exhaust when we're ready to burn the trash, basically, in our DPF. So we have to have some fuel in there, because if you think of something that's partially burnt, it doesn't like to burn really well. The easy burn part of it is already burnt, so we've still got a burnable product, kind of like a charcoal briquette. It's already been partially burnt, so it's not like using wood to cook with. So it's a little bit like that. So it's a little bit harder to get it ignited, but it will still burn. So what we do is we add some fuel to the exhaust, raw fuel into the exhaust. Now this ISX 15 has what you commonly hear Cummins call, or some other manufacturers, a 7th injector or a fuel doser. So the computer starts pumping fuel into this ISX right here, right at the outlet of the turbo before it goes down the exhaust. So it starts putting raw fuel into that DPF. At the same time, it's building heat. Light duty engines fire the injectors on the exhaust stroke. Remember, we're fully independent now with our fuel systems. The camshaft doesn't determine when fuel is injected like in the old days, so the computer can start spraying some diesel fuel into the exhaust, or into the cylinder during the exhaust stroke, which is going to push the diesel fuel right out the exhaust. Now the reason that some do it that way and some use this doser valve, it's about the mileage. Light duty or medium duty vehicle, the projected maybe 250,000 miles that it needs to go. This ISX, they're looking at wanting to go 1,000,000 miles. So instead of wearing the injectors out and spraying on the exhaust stroke, wearing the injectors out early, they put a doser on here and do it this way. So that's kind of the rule of thumb as to whether it has the injectors do it in the engine on the exhaust stroke, spraying some fuel to load this up with raw fuel to burn the trash, basically, or if we use this doser diesel injector right here. So anyway, start creating some restrictions, start building up heat, start spraying fuel into it, one of those two ways. This DPF starts getting hot, hotter, hotter, hotter. We've got a temperature here, and if you look on it, it says temp 1. We've got a temperature sensor here, it's temperature 2, and then we have a outlet temperature sensor, temperature 3, marked over here. So we have 3 temperature sensors on this diesel particulate filter. Gets hot enough, we got enough raw fuel in there, this thing ignites, gets really hot inside, the exhaust temperatures go really high, up over, occasionally approaching 1200 degrees inside this. That's kind of a rare extreme, but it gets really, really hot. So anyway, we burn up all the particulate matter. Last thing on this thing has to be cleaned occasionally because it gets ash in it. So if you think about the old burn barrel, I don't know if any of you have been around one, but you can burn trash and burn trash and burn trash, and every time most of the trash disappears, but there's a little bit of ash in the bottom. So ashes, basically, same thing as a fireplace. If you burn fire in a wood-burning stove, or burn wood in a wood-burning stove or in a fireplace, you know, the ashes start building up, and eventually you have to take the ashes out. So this DPF has to be taken off and cleaned generally about every 250,000 miles under normal operating conditions. So there's a special tool for that. Shops will have that, but the ash has got to be cleaned out of it. They put it in an oven and bake it and kind of incinerate the ash, get it really hot. And there's also an air tool that goes in and blows out and gets the ash out of it. So there's 2 different tools to properly clean a DPF.